I'm Megan. Thanks for joining me today for my weekly somatic video. If you haven't noticed, I release one every Wednesday at 9:30 Central Time. So thanks for being here with me. And if you caught my one last week, we were talking about the planes of the pelvis. I'll put a link up there. If you're not familiar with that, you might want to do that class first. But they're important because oftentimes we have imbalance in the pelvis or restriction in the pelvis, which we may not recognize it in the pelvis. We might feel it as pain in the knees or even the feet or the ankles, or oftentimes we'll see it as a leg length discrepancy, one leg being longer or shorter than the other. We also might have a little twist in the pelvis, so there's all kinds of ways that there can be imbalance. But before we get started, the one thing I said last week that I know held strong for a number of people is know that imbalance does not equal pain. It doesn't have to mean structural damage. But nonetheless, in this class, we're going to move on from last week's, and we're going to do more movements focused on bringing balance into the pelvis, and not just the pelvis itself, but the muscles of the legs working into those and how they all work together. So we'll start this class where we left off last time, which is we're going to come down onto our side body, and you might want a blanket for underneath your head. We'll come down onto the left side first. Get comfy there, like a position like you feel like you could fall asleep. And all we really want to do is stack the right hip on top of the left. And you might take your right hand to your right hip and find the bony landmarks of the front of the pelvis and the back of the pelvis, the side. Just familiarize yourself with the right hip. And then we'll take our hand to our belly and just gently press your belly forward into your hand. And notice how your low back will arch and your tailbone will reach back. And then, as if you're drawing your belly back in, do that. Or the other thing is you can take your hand to your back and press your hand into your low back into your hand. So we're coming forward and back. So if I weren't laying down, we're creating the pelvic tilting motion of anterior and posterior tilt. So that's moving us through the sagittal plane. But we get to do this on the ground now, a little more comfort. So if you want to incorporate your breath to this movement, I find it's healing and definitely takes us deeper into the movement. As you're breathing into the belly, come forward. So the belly will expand. Imagine it bringing your low back forward, and it'll compress your low back just slightly. And then as you breathe out, gently draw the navel center in and press the back towards the back of the room or the room behind you. So once you've found the movement from the belly, maybe take your hand back to your right hip and sense how the right hip in particular, both, but the right hip is tilting forward and then back. And just sensing that forward and back movement in the right hip. And this particular movement, when we're doing it on the side body like this, will be the same, whether we're on the right or the left side. But the focus will change it in that you just want to feel like, is your right hip able to tilt forward, whether it's on your inhale or not, that's up to you, and then back. So that's the first movement. The second one is the coronal, or we sometimes call it the frontal plane. And that shows as a hip lift. So if I keep my hand, now instead of maybe on my hip, I imagine I've got a belt loop right here. And I'm going to squeeze the top of my pelvis or my hip towards my armpit and then push it away. So if somebody's holding that belt loop, they're pulling it towards your armpit and then pushing it away. And notice that you'll feel your left side too moving, but notice how your right hip is getting longer and then shorter, or the side body perhaps. And if you want to add the breath into this movement, I like to inhale and lengthen, create space from the armpit to the hip. As you exhale, feel that slight contraction as you draw the right hip towards the armpit. And just feeling that yourself move through that coronal plane, back and forth. One more round. Then we're going to pause. The next movement we do is a transverse plane, which is just a fancy word for saying there's a rotation of the pelvis. And remember, all of these movements come in when we walk. So this one is this idea that one hip has to come in front of the other. So if I go back to holding my hip like a handle, or I could place my hand in the front of the hip here, I like to think of the easiest way to find the movement is sliding your legs together, sliding your right knee forward, and then gently drawing the right knee back. So I'm not lifting my thigh up, I'm keeping the weight of the thighs heavy, but I'm gonna slide it forward and slide it back. If you find there's discomfort in doing this one, sometimes what helps me, if I had a second blanket, I would leave the one under my head, but putting something between the thighs to lift that right knee, like if you sleep on your side, you're supposed to put a pillow between your knees. That's good for your pelvis, right? So that same idea, I can lift my right knee up so the knee is at the height of the pelvis by putting a blanket there. So you can try that. And you're sliding it back and forth. And you might initially think of moving from your kneecap, but then feel yourself moving from your pelvis. Draw that right pelvic bone forward, and then take it back as far as it will go. And feel yourself moving through that transverse plane. And I'm trying to keep the legs as relaxed as possible. So now that we found all three planes, we'll play with taking them in circles, which is where we ended the last video. So you can do the arching, you can push the hip away, you can draw it back, and you could draw the hip towards your armpit. So I think of making circles with the hip, really slow. And just sensing your breath, that it's comfortable. So if you had a handle now on your hip, you're gently stirring that right hip, and of course your left hip will respond. But see if you can recognize some of those feelings of, for instance, when your low back arches or shortens, you're coming into that sagittal plane, that anterior tilt, and then you might feel the posterior tilt as your tailbone or your low back get long. You can sense that coronal plane when your hip lifts up, the side body will squeeze, and when it goes away. And then you'll also feel the transverse plane in that little bit of the hip coming forward towards the front of your body and towards the back of your body. And whichever direction you're going, just switch the direction. If you're having a hard time isolating the movement in the hip, especially when you switch directions, that'll happen, then go ahead and move the leg to move the hip. Sometimes that's a help. And then see if you can keep the leg still and heavy and move the hip from the hip. One more round. And then just relax for a moment. We're gonna do a couple somatic movements on our side body here. So the first one we do is in that sagittal plane. I'm gonna take my blanket out from in between. You may wanna do the same, mostly because I want it back under my head, giving it a little cushion. I'm gonna lengthen your bottom leg just a little bit, but you still wanna sense that your right hip is on top of the left. So what I imagine is if a rod were going through the top hip and down to the floor, I'm gonna keep my legs, or my hips stacked right on top of the left. But we're gonna get the leg moving in that anterior-posterior tilt. So now, as you inhale, you're gonna lift your right leg up so the heel's about at the height of the hip. You're gonna take the whole leg behind you. So we would say this is extension, and it's the ankle, the knee, and the hip. You're gonna feel the front of your thigh stretch and the back of your thigh engage. And then as you exhale, you can draw the top of the foot towards your shin, squeeze your thigh towards your ribs, and bring it all the way forward. So this is flexion. And what we might sense is the leg is going through extension on the inhale, if you're doing it on your breath, and flexion on the exhale. But is the leg moving the pelvis as well, or do you feel stiffness in the pelvis? So what we should feel is as the leg extends, we go into that, what I was calling last week, the duck butt. Your tailbone lifts, your low back gets short, and the belly stretches. Remember, we are pushing the belly forward. That might happen. And then as you exhale and draw the leg in, the abdominal wall draws in, the low back gets long.
So that's your posterior tilt, or I call it your dog tail. Your dog's in trouble tucking its tail. So whatever image works for you. So see if you can use the leg movement to encourage that tilting of the pelvis from front to back. And you're going to sense how the muscles all work together. You might even get a little fatigued doing this one. Reaching back, go really slow. That's the other thing, is if you don't want to do one breath per movement, sometimes I'll take it to my end point. Here's the top of the inhale end point, and I'm just feeling. Can I notice that my low back feels compressed, my belly's stretching? And not only the belly, but all the way through that whole front leg, I feel spacious. Back leg is contracted but strong, just enough. And then coming the other way, I'll feel that stretching through my backside and that tightening or contracting through the front side. Let's do one more here. Right leg through that sagittal plane. And then let it drop, let it relax. The next one we do is the coronal plane, which in the leg becomes what we call AB and adduction. So we'll keep the legs, bottom leg long, but you're going to lift this right leg up again. Check to see that your toes are pointing forward, so we want to line the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And you're just going to lift the leg up as high as you can go, so that is abduction. You're going to feel your outer hip muscles, right? If you don't, let me know, but you feel some tightening right here. And then you're going to slowly let the leg come down to the front. We're going to switch this up to the front, so that's adduction, your thighs coming down. You might feel some tightening in your inner thigh and a stretching in the outer hip. And then we'll go the other way. Inhale, lift up again. And now exhale, let the toes just touch down behind you. And so what we'll notice is the leg is adducting and abducting as we lift and drop. But do you have that freedom for the pelvis to respond, or maybe even your pelvis is leading this movement? So the freedom in the pelvis will mean as I drop my foot down to the ground, I'm going to feel that lengthening, or it's the hip drop. The right hip is dropping. And then as I lift my leg up, my right hip is drawing up towards my armpit. And then it drops again. Lengthening the hip, shortening the space between the hip and the armpit as the leg lifts, and lengthening. And this is really a full leg movement, right? You're going to feel these are big, strong muscles. Make sure you're breathing. If you need to take a break, please do. So that's how the coronal plane, or the hip lift as we called it last week, translates into the leg, is this movement of AB and adduction. Taking a few more. And then let it come down, relax it. You can even rub your hip a little bit. Say thank you, right hip. So as we're on our side body still, we're going to do that last one, the transverse plane, which was the rotation. But the way we do that, in the way it shows itself in the leg, so in the hip, it's the rotation of the hip coming forward and back. But we're going to bring our knees up for this one, so that my knees are 90 degrees from my spine and my shins are parallel to the spine or to the edge of your mat or your blanket. So this one translates into it translates into your internal and external rotation of the hip. So the first one we'll do is our external rotation. So you're going to keep the big toe side of your feet together. You can place your hand on your right hip. And if you want to do it your breath, breathe in and lift your right hip. And breathe out and drop it down. So we'll do just one part of this motion first. I'm going to inhale and lift up. So that is your external rotation. And you should feel those muscles light up on the outer hip. See if you can keep the left leg quiet and relaxed. Just the right hip. That's why I like to isolate one hip at a time, because often when we do have imbalance, the imbalance is one side of the body, one side of the pelvis. So noticing what it feels like. So what you may sense is that as we're doing this, there is that little bit of rotating the pelvis. So it's rotating upward and back. The pelvis will slide slightly back as the knee lifts, and then it's coming back to neutral. So let's do the other side of this and see how the pelvis would slightly come forward and inward. So the other part, the rotation forward in the transverse plane. So now you're going to keep the knees together. And as you exhale, you're going to lift just the foot up, but make sure that you keep the feet aligned. So a lot of times when we lift the foot, I see the foot go way back here, or the knee will lift too. You want to keep the inner knees touching together and keep the ankles lined up as you lift. So what that's going to do is create an internal rotation of the thigh. You can feel how your thigh rolls inward and then comes back down. Take your time with this one too, just exploring. Notice what it feels like for your leg and feel the muscles in your hip. We want to feel them turn on as we exhale and lift, but release as we come back down. That's the key with all the muscles, right? We don't want to hold a fist all day. We don't want to keep our hands spread all day. So stay with all the muscles in our body. And see if you can feel as you lift that foot how the hip will slightly rotate forward. There's a rotational movement. Let's do one more here. And then we're going to put these two movements together. So if you're doing it to your breath, you would inhale and lift the top knee. So that is your external rotation of your hip. And then as you exhale, drop the knee down and lift the foot. There's your internal rotation of your hip. And taking the leg through these motions is encouraging that little bit of movement of the pelvis through the transverse plane. And we're strengthening and releasing the muscles that help the pelvis to make this movement. But mostly you just want to have sort of a soft, focused awareness, checking to see that you don't have any gripper muscles. So those are the ones that turn on and don't want to go back off. Sometimes they're the places where we feel pain or we have trigger points. So if that's the case, make sure you're resting long enough to let it relax. I might come in and hold the position for a moment. Both sides, just feel it. Is there anything that's tightening, like the bottom leg or your shoulders, your jaw? Check your upper body. Can you just feel that hip? And you can hold the other way. Always an exploration. If you find another way to do this, enjoy it. We'll meet up again soon. And then let the hip come back down. Now it should feel really good to do those rolls again. So put your handle on your outer right hip, roll it around, and just soothe it out a little bit. You can go the opposite direction. See if you have more awareness of rolling that hip. And then stopping for a moment. We're going to be going on to the opposite side, but I encourage you in between, roll onto your back and just rest on your back, whatever leg position feels best for you, and just feel the two sides of your hips and your pelvis. Notice if there's any difference between the two sides. So you're pausing for a moment, just to feel, to release. If you need to change your angle for the camera, do that. I had to for your sake. But we're going to roll on to our right side. You can put something underneath your head if you'd like. Get all cushy, make some noises. And then just sort of stack your knees, bring them up so that they're more at the height of your hips. And we'll find those movements on the left side. So we'll break them down first through the planes of the pelvis. The first one we'll do is the anterior posterior, or the tilting forward and back. So you could take your hand again, first of all, think of your left hip, find those bony landmarks. We want to focus on the left hip this time. And then take your hand to your belly and gently press the belly forward, and notice how the pelvis obediently follows and tilts forward. And then imagine pushing your belly back, or even push your low back into your hand behind you. So we're finding that forward motion and the backward. And the way I describe the pelvis is like a bowl. We're tilting the pelvic bowl forward, like spilling water out of the front and then spilling out of the back. And if you want to do this to your breath, we inhale, the belly expands and takes the pelvis forward into that forward tilt. You'll feel your low back arch. And then as we breathe out, draw the abdominal wall slightly in, a little bit of an active contraction. You can even draw your tailbone down, tuck your tailbone between your legs, so that's your dog tail. Inhaling into the chicken butt or duck butt, lift your feathers, and exhale, dog tail. And then once you find the motion, obviously the right hip is responding and moving, but focus on how does it feel for that left hip? Does it have that ability to come forward and back? You can even hold the front and back of your hip, sensing that tilting. All right, so that's our sagittal plane with our left hip. And now we're going to go into the coronal plane with the left hip. So that's what we think of as a hip lift. So I like to think of the belt loop. If I had a belt loop and somebody was pulling on my belt loop, and you're going to pull that belt loop up towards your left armpit, so there will be a shortening through the waist, through the left side of the body. And then you're going to push that belt loop away, or somebody's pulling it towards your toes, and you'll feel a lengthening through the waist. So your hip lifts up towards your armpit and then runs away from your armpit. And we're doing this, we're initiating from the left hip, but notice how the right hip will respond. As the left hip lengthens, the right hip is shortening, and vice versa. So we're finding the movements from the pelvis first. The legs are relaxed. If it's not working for you, then take the leg in, push that leg forward. So sometimes pushing the leg forward, we can see, yeah, there it is. There's that stretch, that dropping of the left hip, and then pulling it in, which we'll do in a minute, right? Then we feel that lifting of the hip. But then let the legs relax. The next movement we do is the transverse plane, which is that rotational plane. So with this one, you can think of, if you want to use your legs to help find the movement, think of your inner thighs. I had you last time perhaps put a blanket between your knees, and please do that if it feels better for you. This is a nice way to keep your pelvis more squared off. Then I can use my arm as a pillow. So like you're sliding your one thigh, your top thigh, on the bottom thigh. Or think of pressing your kneecap forward and then drawing the kneecap back, or drawing your buttocks back. So we can move from the leg initially, but then touch the front of your hip and take the front of the hip forward, and then take the back of the hip back. And you'll feel that rotation through the pelvis. See if you can keep leg relaxed. And just a nice, gentle gliding motion. One or two more. The blanket's nice because if you don't have slippy pants, it'll help your legs slide better too. And then we're stopping and pausing. I'm going to go back to blanket under my head. But now we can find all of those motions in whatever crazy way feels best for you. So you can think of your arch, your lift, your curl, there's the dog tail, and then the hip away. There's a rotational movement. So you've got the handle on your left hip and you're gently stirring your left hip. And sometimes it just won't happen. It won't budge or it won't move the way we know we can move it. So you need the leg muscles to help to move it. So you can move your leg, get the hip moving, but then let the leg come down, let the leg muscles relax. See if you can isolate just the hip moving. Even if that means that the movements aren't as big, that's okay. Sense the muscles in the hip, rotating the hip, and then you can switch the direction. Go the other way. I like to note too that oftentimes the head will respond, so the neck and the pelvis have a very intimate relationship with each other. So if your head feels like it needs to move, let it move, don't ask why. And then we'll stop. So we've warmed it up, we've hopefully woken up the muscles around the pelvis itself, and now we'll add the leg in. So you're gonna take that bottom right leg slightly long, but just to where you can keep that left hip stacked on top of the right. So we don't wanna be falling forward into that front plane, right? Or to the back plane. We got the hip stacked. Then you're gonna lift the left leg up so that as if you were standing on your leg, the front of my hip bone is in line with the middle of my knee and my middle toe. So right about there, just pausing there for a moment, feel that. And then we'll go into what's called the flexion and extension. So I'm gonna reach my toes and reach my knee back and my thigh. There's your extension of ankle, knee, and hip. The back line of the leg is engaging or shortening and tightening. The front of the thigh is getting a nice stretch. The front of the hip crease is opening up. And then I go the opposite way. I draw the foot towards the top of the shin, draw the knee in, and squeeze that leg in. So there's flexion and extension. And take that back and forth if you want to do it to your breath. I like to think the inhalation, expanding the front, tightening the back. Exhale, we draw the navel center in and draw the leg in. If you're not doing it to your breath, just check in with your breath. Make sure it's medicinal in some way, that it's keeping you comfortable, not erratic. So once you find the leg moving, there's lots to feel here, right? When we go into the whole leg, your ankle, your knee, your hip, all those joints, but really feel if you can sense that the pelvis is going for the ride. So as you exhale and bring the leg forward, you feel that dog tilt. So the back, the low back gets long, the sacral area, and you feel a stretch through your buttocks. And then as you take the leg behind you on the inhale, you'll feel the stretch through the front of the pelvis, and the low back will arch, the belly will stretch. So can you let the pelvis just ride along with the leg, forward and back, that anterior and posterior tilting of the pelvis. One or two more rounds. Might tire yourself out a little bit, that's okay. But go slow. Little fatigue, it's all good. Big muscles. And then let it come down and relax. So we'll take the next one, which is the coronal plane or frontal plane. And that one is when in the leg, it shows as AB and adduction. I never understood why they name them that, just to confuse us, so we have to say the letters. They have to be too similar, the names, but you're gonna lift the leg up again, make sure your toes are pointing forward, so we don't want internal or external rotation, that's coming next, we know that now. But we're straight line, and you're going to lift the leg up, so that is your abduction of the thigh, your inner thigh will stretch, you'll feel that strength in your outer hip. And then you're gonna let the leg fall down, big toe side. So that's your adduction. You might feel a stretch in your outer hip and a little bit of shortening in the inner thigh. And then you lift up again. This time let the toes come to the back. And lifting up, As high as you want to go slow, and dropping down. If you're doing it to your breath, I like to lift on the inhale and slow drop so you're in control with gravity, right? Don't just let it get a hold of your leg. Inhale up and exhale, slow drop behind you. So we're feeling it obviously in the outer hip, maybe the inner thigh, but see if your hip is moving through that coronal plane, which means as you're lifting up into the abduction, your hip is shortening. Your waist is shortening. The hip is hiking up towards your armpit. As you drop the foot down, front or back, your left waist and hip are lengthening away from your armpit, right? It's dropping. And you can really start to use that to your advantage. Use those powerful pelvic muscles to help make this movement. You can also check in and see how that bottom right side is responding. Last one. And let it relax. Okay. So on the side body here, we're still on our side. We have one more, the transverse plane. And that's when we're gonna draw the knees up again so that the thighs are 90 degrees from the spine and the shins are parallel to the spine, or they're resting on the long edge of your mat or blanket. We go through, I like to call these clamshell and mermaid tail. So the first one we'll do is the clamshell. Keep the big toe side of the feet together and lift the inner knee. So I'm not lifting the foot, I'm just lifting the knee so I can feel, there it is, there's that outer hip saying, yes, I'm here. And then I come back down and let it relax. Inhalation is the effort here. Exhalation, drop it down. And what I sometimes find is we have a tendency as humans in life, not just in somatics, to make everything bigger, bigger is better. But if I just lift a little bit, sometimes that brings a whole new feeling of awareness, like it takes more power to just barely lift than to go way up. So go nice and slow as you're playing with this, and maybe stop at different points. So that is our external rotation of the hip. We're rotating it away from the center of the body. And you might notice how the hip itself has to rotate back in that transverse plane. So let's switch and go the other way. Now you're going to keep the inner knees like they're glued together, and you're going to lift just the left leg. So this is internal rotation of the thigh. Watch that you're not kicking the foot forward or back, so keep the heels lined up, the ankles lined up, and coming back down. And doing a few in this movement, this internal rotation of the hip, and you might notice how your hip rotates slightly forward, the pelvis, the left side of the pelvis, to make this leg movement. And once we've done a few on this side, you can put the two together. So when I do it to my breath, I like to inhale and lift the inner knee. Exhale, drop the inner knees, lift the foot. So external rotation on the inhale, internal rotation on the exhale. And if that's all just like juggling too many balls, just breathe comfortably and feel the muscles making this movement. For me, the breath should be a tool to make this movement more mindful. If it's not, if all it's doing is confusing you or causing anxiety, then don't do it to the breath, but make sure your movements are as still and fluid as your breath. We watch for those places where there's jerkiness or it's not easy or smooth to slide through. One more round. And then let the knees relax. And now, once again, soothe that left hip. Say thank you, left hip. And just roll it in circles. Take that handle and stir it up. Nice soothing stir. You can go both directions if you'd like. Last round. And then relaxing for a moment, pause. We're going to be coming to a seated position, but you can either stay here on your side or roll through your back. I'm going to give you a few moments just to feel. Every time we do these, we take the opportunity in between, so you can come onto your back to feel and heal, or I say you're going to locate and land. Notice your hips again, the legs. Reset the GPS. We're going to go on a new journey. And we're going to come up to a seated position, so choosing to roll to your right or your left. And I am going to tuck my mat in here. So we'll want to have a space where we can kind of slide our legs out in front of us, if that's possible. So legs are extended, and you're going to come to a seated position. If you find that sitting upright without any support is uncomfortable for you, then what you can do, make sure there's some slippiness underneath your legs, is to put your back up against a wall. So the wall will help to support the spinal muscles so we can work on the legs and the pelvis. Okay, so that is an option. Please feel free to take yourself to a wall if that's going to work better for you. Otherwise, if the legs are extended and you're not on a wall, you can take your hands behind you to support you, either palms to the ground. You can make fists so your wrists are comfortable. It's all up to you. So we're coming up tall. And the first one we're going to do is just a leg slide. We'll do both legs together. So feel your leg length. And this will take us through that sagittal plane, which is, if we're seated, we can think exhaling is the dog tail, so the pelvis tilts backwards. Inhaling, pelvis tilts forward. That's the duck butt, or I have chickens, so I usually say chicken butt, and then dog tail. So that's what we're going to feel, but we're going to let the legs help us to move the pelvis through those motions. So hands behind you. As you exhale, you're going to slide the heels in, and feel like you're kind of dropping your front body towards your thighs, or thighs in the ribs coming towards one another. You'll feel like your tailbone is tucking underneath you into that dog tail. And as you inhale, you're going to slide the legs out. Let your belly come forward. Notice how you get that little bit of chicken butt. The low back shortens, the belly stretches. That's all it is, very simple. Exhale, curl up. Inhale, extend out. You can lift your heart a little bit. So this one is a little more fluid for the whole length of the spine too. We arch the back on the inhalation as the legs extend, and we curl the back on the exhalation. If you're familiar with cat-cow in yoga, this is similar. Taking the spine through flexion as you exhale, and extension as you inhale. So if the spine is moving, the pelvis should respond. And what I'll sometimes do is take my hands, this takes a little more core action, so if you're doing all this and you want to feel your core helping you, take your hands to your hips instead of back here. And round and extend. If you really want to feel your core action, take your arms out to your sides or overhead. And you'll sense those core muscles that are helping to support your spine, both in the front and the sides. It's mostly front and back, actually, when we're in the sagittal plane. Sliding in and out. One more round. Again, you can have hands down here if you'd rather, or you might be up against a wall. Take the legs out. Let them relax. Shake them out for a moment and just pause.
So the second movement we have been doing is that coronal plane, which we noted when we were on our side is AB and AD duction. So the AB duction is out to the side. Now that we're seated, still the same motion, right? And then coming to the midline is the adduction. So we're going to do that with our legs. You can take your hands behind you. Once again, you can be sitting on the wall. We're going to work with we'll work with the right leg first. So take your left leg slightly over to the left side just to kind of get it out of the way. Give the right leg a little room to play. And the key with this one is I don't want to internal or externally rotate the thigh. I want to keep my kneecap and my toes pointing upward towards the sky. And I'm going to take the leg out to the side, and then I'm going to drag it to the center. Out to the side, and drag it to the center. Doing this to the breath might be something like inhaling and opening, and exhaling and closing. And just sense how you're feeling your hip muscles, right? There's a little bit less of the lifting, and we don't do quite as much of the hip lift, but we're still getting the muscle strengthening of the leg of the AB and AD duction. One thing I watch is that something we'll do if we're weaker with our muscles is we'll begin to bend the knee. So that's kind of a compensation. So you want to gently draw the back of the knee, the back of the calf towards the ground as you're doing this. So you'll feel yourself firm up a little bit more in the thigh. If you do that, even if the movement isn't as big. So I can bend my knee and take my leg way out to the side. But when I keep it straight, less mobility, but I'm feeling more of those hip muscles, bringing the leg in and out. Going slow, you can do 1 or 2 on that side, 1 or 2 more, and then let the right leg relax. Just shake it out a little bit, jelly roll it, should feel good. Check to see, always, if you're not sitting on the wall, that we start to slump back, right? So use your hands, come forward, so that's that pelvic tilt. If I'm not paying attention, I'm gonna go into the dog tail, and I wanna stay in the center. I also don't wanna be in my chicken butt, but I want to be right at the center here, stacking my shoulders over my hips. So now we'll do the second side. Letting the right leg relax, point your left toes and kneecap up towards the sky, and slide it across the midline of the body, and then slide it away from the midline of the body. I'm getting a little caught up on my mat here, but just feeling that. And you can sense, as you come towards the center, your outer hip should stretch. You'll feel some tension or some strengthening in the inner thigh. As you go out to the side, your outer hip will tense or strengthen, and your inner thigh will stretch. Or the appropriate terms are tension is stretching, and compression or contraction is that tightening. And there's this little sense of the hip. It's harder to feel the hip lift and drop, but we're doing good things for the muscles in our legs, and you'll feel it right in the joint where the leg comes into the pelvis. Keeping those toes pointing up, watch that we're not bending the knee. So you might work the back of the kneecap and the calf slightly towards the ground. Just not too much force, just enough force. We talk about force of pushing into or pulling away from. It's a slight force of pushing into the ground to create that muscular strength on the leg. And last one there. Relax it, shake out that left leg. And before we do, we have another one seated. So before we do that, I like to just take my legs in, give myself a little hug. You can rock side to side. Another way, we're gonna be going into internal and external rotation, so you could do a seated little windshield wiper movement here. That might feel nice for the hips. You choose. Stillness or movement. There's a little warm up for the transverse plane here. Or just rounding. If your spine's tired and it wants to rest for a moment, come here and let it rest. Let the back of the spine relax. All right, so the next one in the seated series, is same movement, but we're gonna add that internal and external rotation. So you're gonna start with your legs wide, and this time we're gonna do the two legs together. We won't separate them. Although you may note that I actually find that when I do them together, it's clearer to see if there is any imbalance. But remember, imbalance doesn't equal pain, but let's just see. So now we wanna purposely turn our thigh bones, and start with your legs wide, turn your thigh bones inward. So think of taking the big toe side of your feet down. And right here, this is like a shining moment for me, because I don't know if you can see if I pull back more, but my internal rotation on my left side, which is my lethargic side that doesn't like to do anything, it's my longer side, you can see that I'm very quote unquote flexible. I can get my big toe down to the ground. This is all I got on the right side. So that's already telling me a lot about the imbalance in my body. So you can check that for yourself. And then we go the opposite way, and you're gonna turn your thigh bones outward. So check that. Do you have equal ability to rotate the hips out? So that external rotation. For me, it's fairly even, but just look at yourself and check that out. Again, we're trying not to bend the knees. And then we'll do this one in motion as an exercise. So we use it as an assessment first. And then you can slide your legs in, so internally rotate and slide them towards one another. Externally rotate and slide them away. Internally rotate and slide them in, and external and away. If you want to do it to your breath, I tend to exhale to the midline, inward, inhale outward. And this one really gets pretty gooey with those leg muscles, right? You should feel some firing going on. Take your time, move slow. Notice if one hip might be more responsive than the other, or we catch ourselves in those places where there is stickiness. So if you're trying to jerk the leg along, that's okay, go slow. Work it through slowly. Find that place where you can smoothly slide both legs. If it doesn't happen today, then keep doing this one. That's a sure sign that this is a good exercise for you. Whenever we have to move, whenever our moves are jumpy or in any way restricted, that's a sign that we may have some of that sensory motor amnesia, unless you do know that you actually have some sort of some physical differences in the body, right? So that's not muscular. So we're sliding in and out. Last one. And then let it go, shake it out. Okay, so we've got one more way today that we're going to explore these planes, if you're still with me. And this one takes us onto our hands and knees. So if you typically don't do practices on your hands and knees, this may not be for you. Take your Shavasana now, shut this off. But we're gonna come into all fours, because I find this is a really good way, we're changing our relationship to gravity to feel a little bit more of that strengthening. So we're coming into in yoga what we call table pose, which means we wanna have actually in this case, we wanna have the wrists slightly in front of the shoulders and the knees over the hips. So I want you to have a long line from your shoulder to your wrist. And we're going to go through that sagittal plane first. So now the tilting is, think of spilling your belly down towards the floor, lifting your tailbone. There's your chicken butt, right? That's your inhale. And your exhale is dog tail. Scoop your tail down between your thighs. So find that first, moving from the pelvis. Nothing forced. But let's add a little bit of movement in for the legs too. So now as you exhale and scoop the pelvis, take your hips back towards your heels. So there's that flexion of the legs. And as you inhale and come forward and tilt your pelvis forward, that's your anterior tilt, you can lengthen through your heart and even to your legs. If it's comfortable, you can come here, a little bit of a back bend. Just watch you're not completely dropping the belly and putting too much compression on your low back. So in a fluid movement, we might exhale back, inhale, forward, exhale back, and you can even drop your elbows down to the ground,
Think of that tilting of the pelvis. And as the pelvis tilts forward, the front of the thighs will open and stretch. The back side of your body is strong, supporting that. As you exhale and press back, and the pelvis tilts back, the thighs compress. Please feel free to enjoy this movement for a few more rounds. Get a nice upper body stretch. And then pausing for a moment, wherever you need to pause. I need to do a little wardrobe fix here, microphone check, all that stuff that happens. Behind the scenes. There is no behind the scenes in my videos. Have you ever noticed that? So the next one we're gonna do, it will be that coronal plane. So the coronal plane, reminding you, is a hip lift, right? When we take a step, one hip has to lift up to take that foot forward. So we're gonna do that same thing, but you're going to, I'll face the camera for a moment, you're gonna take your knees together and widen your hands and turn your hands out. You just wanna feel like you have a nice solid platform with your arms. And think that you have a tail. If you had a tail and you wanted to wag your tail, but you've ever seen dogs that wag their tail and their whole butt goes back and forth, right? Well, that's you right now. So I'm going to wag my tail to my right side, and as I wag my tail to my right side, I'm going to think of drawing the right hip towards the right armpit, and then I'm going to release that. And then I'm going to draw my left hip towards my armpit and release. So this is right hip would be lifting as left hip drops, and then the opposite, right? So from a side, it looks like this. We're shortening the left side and releasing. If you want to do it to your breath, I like to exhale and squeeze the one side. If we're focusing on the contraction, I exhale and squeeze the side where the hip and the shoulder are coming towards one another. Inhale, release. So it's really evident for me in this one, except that I've been doing all this stuff all along, but if I just come straight into this in the morning, my right side has no problem compressing and contracting. My left side, not so much. It feels tight, but it doesn't want to move. The restriction there is that the muscles are not awake. The restriction in the right side is the muscles are always working and tightening. So checking that hip lift from side to side. And you can let your head follow, like you're trying to look at your tail. The other thing to consider is this is creating an arch, right? A lateral arch in our spine. So you can think of your whole spinal column as you're doing this, going side to side. One or two more there. And then relaxing, you can come off your hands. If you need to stretch your hands out a little bit, just take your wrists together, fingers come into a little basket, and make some circles. Should feel good. Go both directions, or you make figure 8 shapes. Because we've got one more to do in our table pose, and then you're going to have a really shiny pelvis for the rest of the day, wherever you decide to walk, run, hike, anything else you'll be doing. Mine will be skiing today. So we're going to come back to all fours. In this one, well, let me show you. If this is that hip lifts up, right, but it also one hip comes forward. That is that transverse plane. I can walk on my knees and show you. Forward, right? Forward. So that's the transverse plane, and that's what we're going to simulate here, but in all fours. So this time you want to line up your shoulder over your wrist crease. If your wrists are giving you any grief, you can make a fist instead. Try that out. But I'm going to take my weight into my right leg and hip and lift my left hip up. So I'm thinking of lifting my knee away from the ground and dropping it down. But what often happens when I cue this for somebody is they lift their left hip and then they fall all the way over to the right. We don't want that to happen. We want to keep our shoulder and our hip in line. So keep status quo in the core through your whole torso. See if you can just slightly lift that leg up and then drop it down. And let's try doing opposite sides. So leave your weight in the left knee, Lift the right kneecap up. Or think of sliding your right butt cheek up towards the sky and then drop it down. Do a couple on your right side. And notice if one side you tend to fall in more than the other, and then switch from side to side. Lift one knee, drop it down. I find that I'm more powerful lifting up on the exhalation, inhaling down, because it's helpful once we learn the fine-tuning of the abdominal muscles, the transversus abdominis, and the pelvic floor muscles, which this class, we need a whole class for those, and I have those out. I'll put a note up here, you can do those. But pelvic floor muscles and transverse abdominis are helping me. They're some of the helpers to lift that knee up. So those are best used on the exhalation. I'm drawing my abdominal wall and my pelvic floor inward. They're recoiling, and then as I inhale, I release them. Exhale, draw in. Just going side to side. Watching that tendency to let your hips sway to one side, staying solid through your core, through your whole torso. You can make it fun. You can start to crawl around if you want, because that's how we get into the cross crawl. Okay, I'll crawl right off the camera. And when I come back, you should be settled in. I'm off camera, settled in for your Shavasana. We're all done today. Thank you for playing with me and your hips. Please feel free to come down onto your back in a comfortable position. Highly encourage you to put something under your knees or your thighs if you like to extend your legs. So something like that. You can put extra padding underneath your head, or I'll just double up my mat sometimes. Shake your legs out. So this is that internal rotation, external rotation. You can slide them in and out. And see where your legs want to land so that your pelvis can be as grounded into the floor without feeling pushing, right? You don't want to push it down, just let it relax. And feel broad across the front of your abdomen. Maybe breathe into that spaciousness of the front abdomen. Legs relaxed. Let your shoulder blades release too, and the whole length of the spine. Finding a good, comfortable place for your skull to rest on the ground. So one of the comments I get a lot on these videos is, okay, so I found something in your video, right? It's usually I found an imbalance or a restriction or something like that, because that's what somatics does, is it makes us aware of these imbalances or restrictions that we might not have known were there, or maybe we knew there was something going on, but we didn't know the source of it. So remember when that happens, that you find something that, not to feel bad about it or ashamed or even confused, or sometimes what we do is we go into our storybook. We try to figure out why that imbalance is there, that discomfort, whatever it is that we came across. And there's no reason to do that. You've already done the work in discovering it. That's what I believe. So as you feel your body, know that you just spent this last hour allowing your body to communicate with you. That's all it wants to do. It wants to talk. And the only way it can talk to you is through sensation. So it got to say what it needed to. It knows that you're aware of new things inside of your body. It just wanted to be heard. And you did that. There's no scolding or no shaming. And if it's helpful, instead of thinking of those one or two places, or however many there are, those specific places in your body where you may experience any sort of imbalance or restriction, feel your body as a whole.
we won't label our whole body as bad or tight or weak. It all comes from the same source. It's all strength and love, if you ask me. Send some of that strength and love that's overflowing and abundant in other areas of your body to the spaces that asked for your attention today. And as you're moving throughout your day today, take time again to listen to your body, to let it communicate. And we just hold space for it like we would for another person. We don't need to respond or create stories. We're just listening to the sensations of our body. You can do that as you go on your day and you're walking around your kitchen or out to your car, wherever else we go these days. We're restricted in where we are going, perhaps, but you're still moving your body through these planes of movement. So notice what it feels like. Remember that pain is just our body's way of protecting us. It's just talking louder so that we have to listen. And from this point of relaxation, you're welcome to stay here, come out however you feel most comfortable. I'm going to close our practice today by taking my hands to my heart center. Thank you for joining me, for joining yourself in your body, particularly in your pelvis, the center of your universe. Peace, joy, love, and light. Remember to tune in next Wednesday. I'll have another video available. Don't know what it'll be yet, or I'd tell you. And I appreciate your support. You can donate. You could join my Patreon for as little as $5 a month and support my channel. I really appreciate that. I also have Zoom classes if you want to join me in a more face-to-face, camera kind of face-to-face, no matter where you are. I have some Zoom classes. I have a somatic Zoom class every Friday at 10:30, so you could join me for that. Thanks.